The morning I found the note, I had been sitting alone in the same pew I'd sat in for 31 years. St. Andrew's Lutheran Church in Helen, Kentucky sits at the edge of Route 119, where the road curves hard to the left and the mountain presses down close on both sides. My husband Gerald used to say the church was built crooked on purpose, so that when you walked out the front door you had no choice but to look up at the ridge. He said God designed it that way. I always told him that was the most convenient theology I'd ever heard. He'd laugh. He had a good laugh. Gerald did. He'd been gone 14 months by then. It was a Sunday in late October, the kind of cold that hadn't quite committed yet. Not freezing, just grey and damp and tired feeling. I was 68 years old, recently retired from 30 years as a licensed practical nurse at Harlan R. Harch Hospital, and I was still learning how to be a person who lived alone, still learning how to cook for one, still learning how to sleep on just my side of the bed. After the service, I stayed behind a few minutes the way I sometimes did. I liked the quiet of the sanctuary when everyone had gone. I liked sitting with my hands in my lap and not being anyone's mother or anyone's widow for a little while, just a woman in a wooden pew. When I finally stood to leave, I reached for my coat on the hook beside the pew, and that's when I felt it, a folded piece of paper tucked into the left sleeve. Not dropped in, tucked, deliberately. I looked around. The sanctuary was empty. The deacon had already turned off the chancel lights. Through the tall windows I could see a few people still talking in the parking lot, scarves pulled up, breath making small clouds in the air. I unfolded the paper right there. 4 words, written in blue ink, careful block letters, "Don't sign anything tonight." That was all. I turned it over. Nothing on the back. The handwriting wasn't anyone's I recognized. I stood there long enough that the deacon poked his head in and asked if I was all right, and I told him yes, just looking for my gloves. I tucked the note into my coat pocket and walked to my car. I drove home with both hands on the wheel and the heater running, and that piece of paper sitting in my pocket like something alive. I should tell you about my daughter Renata before I go further, because none of what came after makes sense without understanding her. Or rather, without understanding who she had become. Renata is my only child. I raised her in the same house I still live in, the house Gerald's father built in 1958 on 3 acres at the end of Clover Fork Road. Gerald inherited it when his parents passed, and we raised Renata there, and after Gerald died he left it to me outright. 3 acres, the house, the small equipment shed, and the timber rights to the back hillside. Rights that hadn't been worth much when Gerald's father signed them over, but that had become considerably more interesting in recent years, with the gas company buying up leases across the county. Renata knew about the timber and mineral rights. She'd known for years. What she also knew, because she'd sat at my kitchen table and watched me sign the paperwork, was that Gerald and I had taken out a home equity line of credit 6 years ago to cover his cancer treatments. We'd paid most of it back. Not all of it. Her husband, a man named Clifton, was the one who started calling those debts a burden on the family. That was his phrase, a burden on the family, as if my mortgage was something shameful, something to be managed. Clifton sold insurance out of an office in Middlesbrough and had opinions about everything he knew nothing about. He had been married to my daughter for 11 years. I'd never once heard him ask her how her day was. They started coming around more often after Gerald died, every 2 or 3 weeks, sometimes more, bringing casseroles I didn't ask for, fixing things around the house that didn't need fixing. I told myself it was kindness. I wanted it to be kindness. Then about 4 months before that Sunday in October, Renata sat down across from me at the kitchen table and slid a folder across to me. "Clifton and I have been talking," she said, "and we think the smartest thing would be for you to transfer the property into a family trust. With us as co-trustees, it protects you, Mama. Medicaid planning. If something happens and you need long-term care, they can't come after the house." It sounded reasonable. It sounded almost kind. I told her I wanted to think about it and to please let me talk to Gerald's attorney before I signed anything. She said, of course, Mama. Take your time. But then things started happening that I couldn't quite explain. A letter from the equity line lender arrived, already opened, put back in the envelope. My reading glasses went missing from the counter where I always left them. Twice I found the door to Gerald's study standing open when I was certain I had closed it. I kept the deed in that room, in the file cabinet. The file cabinet I was also fairly certain I had locked. I mentioned the opened letter to Renata, and she said the mail carrier must have done it by mistake. I mentioned the study door, and she said I probably forgot. She said it so gently, with her head tilted just slightly to one side, the way you talk to someone you've decided is losing their mind. I want to be very clear. I have not lost my mind. I worked 30 years in a hospital assessing patients for cognitive changes. I know the difference between forgetting and being told that you're forgetting. I just didn't know yet what to do about it. The Sunday of the note, Renata and Clifton were supposed to come for dinner. She had called the day before to remind me. We're bringing that paperwork again, Mama. The attorney drew up the final version. It'll just take a minute. I'd said fine. I'd said fine because I didn't know what else to say, and because some part of me was still hoping I was wrong about all of it. But I drove home from church with that note in my pocket, and I sat at the kitchen table and read it again. Don't sign anything tonight. Someone at that church knew what was coming to my house for dinner. I thought about who had been near my pew that morning. I'd arrived early, the way I always do. A woman I didn't recognize well had been sitting 2 rows behind me, maybe 60, maybe older, with silver hair cut close to her head and reading glasses on a beaded chain. I'd nodded at her. She'd nodded back. I'd assumed she was visiting, maybe family of one of the regulars. I should have looked harder. Should have asked the deacon. But at the time, I hadn't known what I was looking at. I put the note in the kitchen drawer, under the dish towels. Then I went and called Gerald's attorney. His name is Mr. Absher, Leonard Absher, been practicing in Helen County for 40 years. He and Gerald used to fish together. I got his voicemail, left a message, said it wasn't an emergency, but I needed to speak with him before I signed anything regarding the property. Then I made supper. Renata and Clifton arrived at 6:15. She had brought a pie, which she set on the counter without being asked. And Clifton sat down at my table and opened his briefcase before I'd even offered them anything to drink. We're just missing your signature on 2 pages, he said, spreading papers out in front of him. He had the particular energy of a man who has already decided how an evening is going to go. I sat down across from him. I said I'd left a message for Mr. Absher, and I'd like to wait until I'd spoken with him. Clifton looked at Renata. Renata looked at the table. Then she looked at me and said, Mama, we've already paid for the attorney who drew this up. It's standard language. Leonard doesn't need to review it. I'd like him to review it, I said. What happened next is something I have turned over in my mind many times since. Clifton picked up the papers, tapped them on the table to straighten them, and set them back down directly in front of me. He put a pen on top of them. He did not raise his voice. He smiled, actually, and he said, Helen, we're trying to protect you. The equity line has a balloon payment coming in March. If you're not positioned correctly, you could lose this house. He knew about the balloon payment. I had never told him about the balloon payment. How do you know about that? I said. Renata mentioned it, he said. I looked at my daughter. She was looking at the window. I said I wasn't signing anything that night, and I'd appreciate it if they'd take the papers with them when they left. I said it quietly because I was raised to be polite, but I said it clearly. Clifton put the papers back in his briefcase. Renata ate 1 slice of pie and said almost nothing. They left by 8 o'clock. I locked the deadbolt. Then I went and sat in Gerald's study and thought about what I knew. Gerald was a quiet man, but he was thorough. That was how he operated. He never made a scene, never raised his voice, but he paid attention to everything, and he left things in order. He had always said that the greatest act of love a person could do for their family was to make sure nothing was left a mystery. After he died, I'd gone through his study carefully, the way he'd asked me to, filed things, closed accounts, notified the pension administrator. I thought I'd found everything. But there was one drawer in his desk, the bottom left, the deep one, that had a false bottom. I didn't know that until the night after Renata and Clifton left, when I sat at his desk and put my hand down into the drawer and pressed, and the panel shifted. Underneath it was a sealed envelope with my name on it in Gerald's handwriting and a small flash drive taped to the outside. I sat there for a long time before I opened it. His letter was 4 pages, legal pad, his careful engineer's handwriting. He had written it 8 months before he died, when the treatments weren't working, and he knew. He wrote that he loved me. He wrote that he was sorry for not saying that more often and in more specific ways. He wrote about the summer we took Renata to the Smokies when she was 7, and she cried because she thought a deer was lost. And then he wrote about Clifton. He had discovered, while reviewing our finances during his illness, an illness that had required him to organize our assets carefully, that Clifton had been quietly researching the mineral rights to our property. Clifton had a contact at a land acquisition company based in Lexington. Gerald had found an email chain forwarded to him accidentally by his cousin who worked at a title company in which Clifton laid out a plan. Get Helen into a family trust, position himself and Renata as co-trustees, then execute a lease transfer on the mineral rights to the acquisition company. His cut was estimated at $62,000. Gerald had put the email chain on the flash drive. He wrote, I didn't confront him because I didn't want the last months of my life to be about Clifton, but I left this for you so that you would know, and so that you could decide what to do with the truth when you were ready for it. I trust you to handle it exactly right. You always have. I read that letter 3 times. Then I put it back in the envelope and I sat in the dark for a while. I was not ready to cry yet. That would come later. What I felt in that moment was something closer to clarity. I called Leonard Abshire the next morning when his office opened at 8:30. His paralegal put me through immediately. He'd gotten my message from Sunday. I told him I needed to come in. He said, come now. I drove to his office on Central Street with the flash drive and Gerald's letter in my purse. I sat across from Leonard at his big oak desk, and I put both things down in front of him and I said, Gerald left me some information I think I need a lawyer to help me understand. Leonard read the letter slowly. He plugged the flash drive into his computer and read through the emails. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then he took his glasses off and set them on the desk and he said, Helen, does Renata know her husband was planning this? I don't know, I said. I've been asking myself that for 24 hours. He said we needed to move carefully. He said the first step was to send a formal letter to Renata and Clifton stating that all future communications regarding the property were to go through his office. He said the second step was to contact the county clerk's office to make sure nothing had been filed on the property without my signature. Because it was possible, he said, given what was in those emails, that they might have tried to file paperwork with a forged signature. I hadn't thought of that. My hands went cold. He picked up his phone right there and called the county clerk. He was on hold for a few minutes. I looked out his window at the parking lot. A woman was loading groceries into a green minivan. Leonard said, and then he said, thank you, and he hung up. He looked at me carefully before he spoke. Someone filed a quitclaim deed on your property 11 days ago. I didn't sign a quitclaim deed, I said. No, he said, you didn't. What followed was not quick, and it was not easy. But I want to tell you the shape of it, because that matters too. Leonard filed an emergency petition to void the fraudulent deed that same afternoon. Because there was a forged signature on a filed document, it became a criminal matter, not just a civil one. The county sheriff's office got involved. 2 detectives came to Lynard's office 2 days later, and I sat across from them and showed them Gerald's letter and the flash drive and answered every question they asked me. Clifton had used a notary he knew from his insurance work, a woman who had since left the county. They found her in Knoxville, Tennessee, 3 weeks later. She cooperated. Renata called me 4 times the week the detectives got involved. I did not answer. I sat with that silence for a long time, deciding what it meant. What I finally decided was this: I didn't know yet how much she'd known, and until I did, I had nothing to say to her that wouldn't make things worse. Clifton was charged with forgery and fraud. His trial took 8 months. I testified. I wore the same blue dress I'd worn to Gerald's funeral, not because I planned to, just because it was the first thing I took out of the closet that morning, and I only noticed when I was already in the car. He was convicted on both counts. Sentenced to 4 years, eligible for parole in 2. Renata and I talked eventually. We sat in Lennon's conference room with a family mediator between us, which was the only way I could do it at the time. What she told me was that she had not known about the forged deed. She had known about the plan to transfer the property to a trust. She said she'd believed Clifton when he said it was for my protection. She said she hadn't asked enough questions, and she knew that, and she was sorry. I listened to her say all of that. I looked at my daughter, 51 years old, without her husband, starting over. And I thought about the girl who cried over the deer in the Smokies. I thought about what Gerald wrote: "I trust you to handle it exactly right." I don't know if I forgave her that day. Forgiveness isn't a moment in my experience. It's more like a direction you start walking in, and some days you walk further than others. What I told her in that conference room was that I loved her, and that she was going to need to earn my trust back over time, and that I was willing to give her the opportunity to do that. But I was going to need her to be different, more honest, more willing to ask the hard questions, even when the answers were uncomfortable. She said she understood. We're still walking. I found out who left the note about 8 months after everything was over. Her name is Arlene. She'd been Gerald's cousin's wife for 30 years, on the side of the family I'd never known well. They lived in Bell County, didn't come to Harlan much. She'd known Gerald since he was young, and she'd known, through the same title company cousin who sent Gerald the email chain, that something was being planned. She hadn't known quite how to reach me. She'd heard from someone I went to St. Andrews, and so she drove over one Sunday and sat 2 rows behind me and tucked that note into my coat sleeve, because she couldn't think of a more reliable way to make sure I found it. I called her after I learned all this. We talked for 2 hours. She came to my house for Thanksgiving that year, she and her husband both, and we sat at my table, the same table where Clifton had laid out those papers, and we ate turkey and green beans and the sweet potato casserole my mother used to make, and we talked about Gerald. She told me stories about him as a boy that I'd never heard. That was its own kind of gift. The property is still mine. The mineral rights are still mine. Leonard helped me establish an actual trust, a legitimate one, with a bank as co-trustee, and terms that protect me without giving anyone control over what I've built. The balloon payment on the equity line was restructured once the fraud was documented. The lender worked with me once they understood the situation. I still go to St. Andrews every Sunday. I still sit in the same pew. Some mornings, when the light comes through the east windows just right, I look up at the ridge the way Gerald used to say God intended, and I think about all the ways that love can leave itself behind in the world, in a letter in a hidden drawer, in a note tucked into a coat sleeve by a woman you barely knew, in the careful way a man organized his papers when he knew he was dying, so that the person he loved most would have what she needed after he was gone. I have learned that help does not always announce itself. Sometimes it wears the face of a stranger. Sometimes it comes from a man who has been gone for 14 months, who knew you well enough to know you'd be ready for the truth when the time came. Gerald was right about that. He was right about most things. I just wish I could tell him so. There is a thing I used to tell patients when I worked the floor at Harlan Arsh, not officially, not as medical advice, just something I believed and had seen proven enough times to trust. The body keeps a record of what the mind tries to ignore. You can talk yourself into almost anything if you work at it long enough. But somewhere underneath all that talking, you already know. I knew something was wrong long before I let myself admit it. I knew when my letter arrived, opened. I knew when the study door was standing open for the second time. I knew when Clifton put that pen on top of those papers and smiled at me the way you smile at someone you've already decided doesn't matter. What I didn't have yet was the courage to name what I knew and the evidence to stand behind it. That's the thing about integrity. Real integrity, not the kind you perform for other people, but the kind you practice when no one is watching. It requires you to keep faith with what you actually see, even when the easier thing is to look away. I had spent a year being polite, being accommodating, telling myself that my daughter loved me and that love was sufficient protection. It wasn't. Love without honesty is just a feeling. It doesn't protect anyone. Gerald understood that. He had sat alone in that study during the worst months of his life, and instead of spending his remaining energy on anger or confrontation, he had done the harder and quieter thing. He had gathered the truth carefully, documented it cleanly, and left it where I could find it when I was ready. That takes a particular kind of clarity, not just intelligence. Anyone can be clever, but wisdom, the kind that knows the difference between what feels urgent and what actually matters. He chose what mattered. He chose what mattered. He chose me having the truth over him, having the satisfaction of the confrontation. I think about that when I think about how I handled the months after. I could have fallen apart. I had reason to. Instead, I made the calls I needed to make. I sat across from detectives and answered their questions without exaggerating or minimizing. I testified in a courtroom in the same blue dress I'd worn to Gerald's funeral, and I told the truth and I did not waver. Not because I am a particularly strong person in some dramatic sense. I am not. I am a 68-year-old retired nurse from Harlan County who is afraid of driving in ice and cries at animal commercials. But I had done what needed to be done because I understood, finally, that no one was coming to protect what I had built if I didn't protect it myself. That understanding, arrived at late, still arrived. That's what matters. And Renata. I have thought about what to do with Renata more than anything else in this whole story. What I keep coming back to is this. People who do wrong things are not always people who set out to do wrong. Some of them are people who asked too few questions and trusted the wrong person and let convenience substitute for conscience. That is its own kind of failure. But it is a different one, and it asks for a different response. I chose to stay in it with her, not because it was comfortable, but because walking away from my own daughter felt like letting Clifton take one more thing from me, and I had already let him take enough. What Arlene did, driving to a church she'd never attended, to slip a note into the coat of a woman she barely knew, that was a simple act of basic decency carried out at some inconvenience to herself, with no guarantee it would do any good. She did it because she thought it was right. That's all. That is enough. That is, I think, what most of us are actually capable of if we decide to be. I am still walking. So is Renata. Some days we walk further than others. That feels like the right place to end.